Good morning, guys. We're in an early model JK with a LT1 10-speed. This JK is really clean and it has a Type 2 GM 10-speed. It was around 19 or 20. GM made some improvements to the 10-speed and it runs a different module than the earlier 10 speeds. Not really sure what they did, but it's a fantastic transmission. The main thing that I notice is that it learns almost instantly. On the early 8 speeds, it took forever for the transmissions to learn. On the Type 1 10-speed, they learn pretty quick, I thought, and they shift great. It's quickly becoming my favorite transmission, the 10-speed. But these Type 2 10-speeds just seem to learn right out of the box. I grew up just a little bit too late to experience the full muscle car experience. I grew up in the 70s when the cars were very pathetic. The engines were really pathetic. But the muscle cars from the 60s were still cheap and available, so I bought a lot of them. And one of my favorite cars were the Hemis. Now, I've always been a GM guy. I love the small block Chevy. I love the big block Chevy. I like that you can easily modify them. Parts were always available. Parts were always less expensive. If you ever went to one of these big warehouse engine companies like PAW, I don't know if they're still around, Performance Automotive Wholesale, they just had everything for the small and big blocks. The super shops, you guys might remember them. You go to any auto parts store and you'd have parts for small block Chevys and sometimes big block. You'd even have intake manifolds and carburetors in stock for these engines. So bang for your buck, I always thought the Chevy was a better value. Now that doesn't take anything away from Mopar. And I will say the big three companies, Ford has probably been the least prominent in my life. And I don't know why. I owned a 67 Shelby GT500. I've owned a lot of Fords. I had a 66, I think it was, Fairlane factory race car, 427 side oilers. I've had a lot of Fords in my life. I'm rambling about this because the word on the street is that the Hemi is going to be discontinued next year in 2023. At the same time, they're going to be bringing in this new Stellantis 6-cylinder Hurricane, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm not a Hemi historian, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I know. The Hemi as we know it, and remember, there's a lot of engines out there that are Hemis, not just the Chrysler. It just so happens that the V8 Chrysler has had the Hemi in production American automobiles, and most of the other companies don't want to go through that hassle. They just use a wedge-shaped combustion chamber, which has proven to be very efficient. In World War II, the piston engine technology was really reaching its limits. The law of diminishing returns were kicking in, and it was costing a lot of money to get a little bit of extra power. And remember, in an airplane, it takes geometrically more power to go just a little bit faster. So if it takes 100 horsepower to go 100 miles an hour, it might take 150 horsepower to go 110 miles an hour. I don't know the exact calculation, but it's pretty massive. So all sorts of crazy ideas were coming out. We had engines well over 30 liters in fighters. We had dual stage superchargers, turbochargers, dual speed superchargers, fluid drive superchargers, just anything they could to cram air and fuel into that engine to get more power at altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a very advanced fighter, and it flew at high altitudes where it was almost unmatched. That's why the fuselage was so large, because the supercharger system that it ran to feed that radial engine. Republic and Chrysler got together to develop the ultimate P-47. I think there was the XP-72, don't quote me, but there was another one. And basically what Chrysler did is they built a massive, large liter engine with hemispherical combustion chambers. And it proved to be extremely powerful. And it pushed the Thunderbolt to over 500 miles per hour. The problem for Chrysler was the war was ending and turbine engine technology had been introduced. Once turbines got into the high-performance aircraft, it was pretty much over for the internal combustion engines, or ICE engines as they call them now. But there were some really interesting developments at the end of the war. There were sleeve valve engines, two-stroke engines, just all sorts of crazy stuff to get a little bit more horsepower, and of course the massive size of these engines, pushing 35 liters and larger. After the war, Chrysler said, what can we do with all this technology we developed? So in the 50s, Chrysler built the Hemi car engine. We all know about it, the 340 whatever. There was a couple of different ones, and they were used in everything. They were used for generators, they used them in cars. Now they weren't exactly the most high performance engines. They weren't running the highest compression and the largest carburetors and all that. Of course they did have some higher performance ones, but the engine was pretty much a just everyday engine with a very efficient combustion chamber, and they had a lot of success with it. By the 1960s, the muscle car wars were warming up, and Chrysler decided that they wanted to compete. So they came out with a 426 Hemi. And let me say this, I've owned many 426 Hemis. Probably my favorite was the 68 Charger 500 Hemi. It was known as Propane X. You guys can Google it. That was a vehicle that was built by IMCO. I think it was a propane company, and they actually ran the thing on the drag tracks. I think it was like a 9 or 10 second car running on propane. But it was originally a Charger 500 Hemi. The Charger 500 was basically the same car as the Daytona without the wing and that funny front nose. You guys are probably familiar with the Superbird that Richard Petty drove, the blue one, had the wing and that front nose. I had a Superbird too, and the Superbird had a 440 in it, just a 440 Magnum. And I wanted to say that I've owned a lot of Chryslers. My two favorite engines are the 346 pack, which is a massively powerful engine for its size. I have one on my Challenger TA. And then the 440 Magnum. The 440 Magnum was really a strong engine. They put them in the RTs and all sorts of other road runners and things, and it really was kind of an unglorified Hemi. While the 426 Hemi got most of the attention, the 440 cars were really nothing to sneeze at. The 446 pack cars were a match for pretty much anything else on the street, including the 426 Hemi. But the Hemi always had this nostalgia about it. It's a hemispherical combustion chamber. Well, at the end of the day, I mean, pretty much every European car and Japanese car and now a lot of the American cars have Hemi engines. But back in that day, it just kind of meant something special. Out of the box, the Hemi was okay, but it didn't really light the world on fire. The Hemi really needed some tweaking to perform. It had dual carburetors that, I don't know if they were the AVS or the AFBs, but they were easy to tune, pretty easy to tune. They had metering rods that would stick down into a jet, and then they had springs that, based on intake vacuum, would pull these rods up and down, and they had steps on these jets, or the steps on the rods, so it made it really easy to tune compared to a Holly. With the Holly, you had to pull the bowl off and physically change the jets. With the Carters, you could just take a screw out and put a new metering rod in, change the springs for the opening rate, and you could go. But the Hemi needed more than that. It wasn't just the fuel. I find that the timing on the Hemi, the ignition timing, you really had to mess with it to get the Hemi to perform. But once you did, it was a really strong engine. I would say out of the box, though, even a 440 Magnum would outrun a Hemi, and the 446 pack, I don't think the Hemi would have had a chance against out of the box. Once you tweaked the Hemi, then it was very formidable. And then, of course, you had the big block Chevy. I have an LS6 Chevelle, 450 horsepower, and I do believe that was the most powerful engine Chevrolet had made right up until, I don't know, maybe the ZR1 in the 90s. But in the muscle car era, the LS6 Chevelle was known as one of the most powerful Chevys out there. So the Hemi had its glories in the mid to late 60s, and of course by the 70s, regulations, insurance, and everything else, emissions, killed off the muscle car era. So the Hemi went away. When Chrysler decided to reintroduce the Hemi, they made it pretty much a work engine. They put it in Ram trucks, they put it in the Dodge Challenger, they put it in all sorts of stuff. Now the modern Hemi isn't a full Hemi like some of the engines in the old days. Chevrolet on the big block Chevy went to what they called a semi-Hemi, where they splayed the valves to get a little bit of cant to both the valves. But really with Chevy, they kind of stuck with that wedge-shaped combustion chamber, and the new LTs have heads that where a lot of time was spent, thousands and thousands, in fact, I think even millions of hours of CAD design on the LT engines to get that combustion chamber to work as well as it does. So for a lot of years now, the Hemi has carried the torch for Chrysler with their V8 engines, and it's a good engine. Now my friend had an early model non-VVT 5.7 in his truck, and it just couldn't cut the mustard, so he ended up upgrading to a diesel Ram truck to tow his trailer. But really, Chrysler has evolved the Hemi to the VVT and the 8-speed and all that. So in its latest iterations, it's a very formidable engine. One of the biggest advantages the Hemi has is its cubic inches. It's 6.4 liters, at least the 392. Now if you compare that to the LS and the LT, the Hemi has an advantage in cubic inches, unless you look at engines like the 7-liter LS7 and stuff, but we're not talking about that. So Chrysler used the old philosophy of there's no replacement for displacement and just made a large engine. They made it out of cast iron, which I think if they had made the choice to make it out of aluminum, would have saved a lot of weight and maybe given more life to the engine. But really, if you look at Chrysler's history with who owns it and what's going on in management, it's just been all over the place. When Mercedes owned it, they had one goal, and then Fiat bought it, and now I guess Stellantis is a combination of Fiat and Peugeot, or French and Italians. So the decision was made to axe the Hemi, and over the years, all sorts of engines have been coming out to replace the V8s, whether it's a turbocharged 4-cylinder or the Pentastar, a high-technology V6. Now they're coming out with this twin turbocharged straight 6, which has a lot in common, I think, with the Ford EcoBoost direct injected. The Ford EcoBoost, I think, is 3.5 liters, and the new Hurricane engine is 3 liters. But here's the deal. The Hemi is probably going to be dropped next year. In fact, there's a really high likelihood it'll be dropped next year. And Chrysler's going to have to put something in its place. You got the Challengers and Chargers, and you got the guys in the Ram trucks, and of course the guys in the Wranglers, and they all want that V8 performance. Now, knock on wood, GM has decided to stay with the V8 platform, but one of the things GM did that Chrysler didn't is they greatly improved that V8 platform. They did go to an all-aluminum construction for lightweight. The Stellantis motor, I think, is 414 pounds or so, and the LT is really not that much heavier than that. In my experience, the LTs get better fuel economy than the Hemis because of their technology. You know, the higher compression. We're talking 11.5 to 1 compression versus about 10.9 in the Hemi. So let's try to get back to the subject. The Hemi's going to go away, and what's going to replace it? Well, from what I understand, it's going to be this new Hurricane engine. Now, the new Hurricane engine is designed for better efficiency. It's lighter weight. It's got 2 turbochargers. It's 3 liters. So will it be direct replacement for a Hemi? No, of course not. It will never be a V8. Can it outperform the Hemi? Yes. With turbochargers, you can pretty much dial in anything you want. So we're taking a small displacement engine, less than half the size of the Hemi, and we're boosting it. And I think that this thing is going to have like 26 pounds of boost with over 10 to 1 static compression. That's massive. They're really asking a lot out of this small engine. Now, the reviews and the guys that I know in the industry say that it performs really well. The bottom end, the Hemi still has an advantage. Not only does it have the sound, but it has better throttle response and torque down low. They say that the Hurricane engine has a slight amount of turbo lag, but it's really not bad. You have to actually feel for it. Then in the mid-range and the top end, this little 3-liter engine is a match for the V8. And this is nothing new. If you go all the way back to the Brooklyns and the racers at the turn of the century, the last century, they were using superchargers to make small displacement engines powerful. The beauty of a turbocharger, and I use the word supercharger interchangeably with a turbocharger because essentially that's how it started, and they still consider a turbocharger a supercharger. So these supercharged engines from the turn of the century were very small displacement engines putting out a lot of horsepower. Some companies like Bentley took very large displacement engines, put superchargers on them, and got massive horsepower. But this is something that's been done over and over. Ford's EcoBoost is a perfect example. Direct injected, small displacement, and it was meant to replace the V8. And overall, I think it's performed pretty good. I think it's had a little bit of a bumpy road at the beginning, but overall it's done a pretty good job of mimicking the V8. One of the benefits of a boosted engine is you can pretty much dial in whatever power you want. And they learned that in World War II. The more boost you could run, the more power you could put out. So Mustangs were running 40, 50, 60, 70 inches of boost at high altitude, giving their engines an advantage over the Access fighters. One of the biggest problems with the Access fighters was their fuel. They were running 97 octane, 100 octane maybe on the outside, where the Mustangs at minimum were running 100 and even up to 150 octane. When you have 150 octane fuel, you can really crank that boost up and get that extra power. So even though the Mustang had, I think it was a 27-liter engine, it way outperformed the German fighters that were running at low boost with engines over 30 liters. And it's the same thing with these small engines. You take a little 3-liter engine, you boost it to 20-something pounds, and you're going to put power out, and that's all there is to it. So the question is going to be longevity, drivability, like turbo lag. From what I understand, it's a very smooth engine. And I'm a big fan of the straight 6. The straight 6, all the way back to the days of the Pontiac overhead valve engine, have always impressed me. The straight 6 engine runs really smooth. It has virtually perfect balance, but there was a couple of problems with the straight 6 architecture. One was it was longer than a V8, so cars had to accommodate it. And in the day, the longer the nose of your car, the more prestigious it was. That's why the straight 8 cars had those really long hoods. But as time evolved, the V8 took over and the hoods became a little bit shorter, gave the passengers more room. So the straight 6 started to get a little bit long in the tooth. But companies like Nissan, remember the Z cars? Pontiac did their overhead valve straight 6. And there were some high performance straight 6s out there. One of the biggest issues with a straight 6 under a lot of stress is the length of the crankshaft. It's a long crankshaft compared to a V8. So the torsional stress on the crankshaft could cause failures. And they found that out when they started to race the Pontiac engines, because the Pontiac engines were holding their own against the V8s in the 60s and 70s, mainly in like offshore racing boats. But they found out, like the Nissan guys found out, that the life expectancy of the crankshafts was limited based on those torsional stresses. So I am sure Chrysler or the French or the Italians or whoever made this engine knows that and have designed that strength into it. The twin turbochargers are going to give it better boost. I think they did a 3-in-3 like turbocharger. I'm not exactly sure. There's bi-turbos. There's different ways of setting up the turbos. But if you set them up right, one small displacement turbo and a larger displacement turbo, you can minimize or ultimately get rid of turbo lag. One thing about the turbo, though, is you got to have exhaust pressure to spin that turbo up. So right off the line, it's never going to be a V8 because it doesn't have the displacement of the V8. But as soon as the turbos come in, then you have pretty much any amount of power that you want. Now, you guys out there that are supercharging your 3.6s or your 3.8s, you know all the challenges to make these things run right. But this is now being done at a different level. This is being done at an OE level, where you have proper 1 and 2 bar operating systems, maybe 3 bar, I don't know. The engine was designed from the ground up to handle boost, and it's over 10-to-1 compression with over 20 pounds of boost, which is really impressive. So what you have here is a small displacement, high-stressed engine that is going to try to take the place of a large displacement, low-stressed engine. Now, personally, I'm going to be sad to see the Hemi go. And this is really not a concern of ours because, as you guys know, we're doing the LTs, but I would like to see the Hemi stay around, and hopefully Mopar will continue to support it. I feel if they put that engine in the JL and the JT, it's going to be a phenomenal engine. It's going to be the engine that a lot of you guys have tried to build by supercharging your 3.6, couldn't afford a Hemi, whatever. We're going to have Hemi level performance in a lighter weight, smaller package. One thing that surprised me is the economy. This engine was designed from the ground up for efficiency to be more efficient than the V8. But from what I understand, it only gets about 1 mile to the gallon better than the Hemi in a lot of situations. So you'd say, why go from a Hemi to this high-tech, high-stressed engine for 1 mile to the gallon? Well, I don't know, but that's a decision that Chrysler made, and I think the Europeans in general are against large displacement cast iron V8 engines, and they just want to get rid of it. So time will tell about the durability and all that, but you know darn well that the aftermarket's going to jump on this and start boosting these engines up. I've been in some of those little 4-cylinder turbos that have been boosted, and they're quite impressive. And really, at the end of the day, what matters is that you get your Wrangler down the road and you feel safe with the amount of power that you have. Really, in the early 3.8 JKs, especially with large tires, they can almost be unsafe. The 3.6 Pentastar made a big improvement on that. So Chrysler has a whole smorgasbord of engines to choose from. The turbo 4-cylinder, the hybrid 4-cylinder, the e-torque Pentastar, the standard Pentastar, the Hemi. If they could distill all that down into 1 or 2 engines, and from what I understand, there's going to be 2 of these Hurricane engines. One's going to be rated at just over 400 horsepower, one's going to be rated at just over 500 horsepower, which is pretty massive. So what it's going to come down to is, are you going to prefer the high-tech, higher-stressed turbo engine? And I'd say in most cases the turbo engine's going to have some advantages, but in other situations it won't, just like in the past. Like if you're towing a trailer up a grade, the larger displacement engine, I think, being low stressed is better than having a turbo putting out constant boost. In off-road situations with like water crossings and such, I'm sure they got that figured out. But I do take my Jeep off-road and beat it up a little bit, and I just love the sound, the torque, the reliability of the V8 engine. Now, one day, you never know, I might try one of these turbo things out. And for me, at least right now, because the LT I feel gets better economy than the Hemi, and the Hurricane gets slightly better economy than the Hemi, I think we're talking about 6 of one, half a dozen of the other on that. GM is really stayed ahead of the curve on the overhead valve engine. Everybody has their opinion. Everybody has their favorite V8 engine. The Ford guys have the Coyote, which is an excellent engine. Chrysler guys have had the Hemi for a lot of years. Really is an archaic engine. The GM guys had the LSs, now they got the LTs. And really all that matters to you is that you get a powertrain that you're comfortable with. And I think a lot of guys are going to like this new 6-cylinder. I like 6-cylinder. I like straight 6 engines. I'm not a big fan of V6s because of the imbalances that they can impart, but the straight 6 has always been a reliable performer for me. So really what this video is about is the end of the Hemi. When Chrysler drops the Hemi, what are the substitutes going to be? What is your options going to be? I think for the newer vehicles, that new Hurricane 6-cylinder is going to be an excellent option. I think the guys that have the older JKs, they'll still have a choice of going to a V8. In my opinion, that's still going to be top of the line for the JK. We're going to take this 2-door early JK LT1 on the trail, and we'll see you again.